Considering running Curse of Strahd for your players? This video is for you. Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. The idea of this video is to kind of give a sort of high level overview of Curse of Strahd. I'll be covering things like the setting, the tone and style of the campaign, do a run through of kind of what to expect in all the chapters, and answer some questions at the end. Before I move on, this is intended for DMs, Dungeon Masters. I'm really sorry if you're a player of Curse of Strahd or a pending player and you want to learn more about it. This is kind of giving more advice about how to run it, or should you run it for your players. It will be full of spoilers because I'm literally going to be talking about bits of the book and the story. So I might do a players focused one in the future, we'll see. But if you are a player, I'm sorry, best click away now or you may see spoilers. And if this is the first video of mine you're watching, hello, my name is Steve, this is DM of the Mists, and I cover just Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft 50-50. And so if you're thinking of running Curse of Strahd, you might want to consider subscribing. Or if you're thinking of running a wider Ravenloft campaign or some Ravenloft one-shots where you've got other domains of dread, or other lands like Barovia, the mainland in Curse of Strahd, then feel free to check them out. So let's talk about the setting first of all. The setting is the land of Barovia. Barovia is a domain of dread, and the domains of dread are almost like pocket demi-planes and domains in a buried away part of the Shadowfell. The idea behind them is that there's gods, but they're kind of above gods, called the Dark Powers, and they imprison extremely evil people in different domains. And they're separated by mists, which some people can travel towards, or the mists might pluck someone away from, say, the Sword Coast, or a different world, and put them in Barovia or a different domain of dread. The tone and the style, so it's gothic horror. And gothic horror might not be every player's cup of tea. The kinds of monsters you can expect are vampires, obviously. Strahd is a vampire, I wouldn't even need to tell you that. If you just look at what he looks like on the cover, you can probably think, that man looks like a vampire. But there's also werewolves, witches, zombies, and other undead. And it feels different to other D&D campaigns. Compare it to something like Lost Mine of Phandelver, where you've got goblins. Sorry, spoilers now for Lost Mine of Phandelver, for an adventure that's, I think, been out for about 12 years. Hopefully I'm not spoiling it for anyone. But it's got things like goblins and a dragon and things like that. And it's got tropes. So it's got the vampire tropes and werewolf tropes. There's a Frankenstein trope, so there's somebody there who sort of experiments on people and can make flesh golems. And you might have heard rumours, and I will confirm these rumours, that Curse of Strahd is a more difficult campaign for players than other campaigns. And it is true. And you've got to be careful that it doesn't sort of feel like a grind or become demotivating for players. I've heard stories, read stories online, where people say, my players don't want to play anymore because they just find it too hard. They find it too miserable. Hence the whole, it may not be everyone's cup of tea thing. It's important to bear in mind that there can be some trigger content. And I'll give a trigger warning now. There's things like child death, multiple instances throughout different parts of the campaign. Vampires are metaphors for sexual predation. So you might want to do a session 0. I might do a video about the ideal Curse of Strahd session 0 soon. And you might argue, but it's a horror campaign, it's got to be horrible, it's got to be horrific. Yes, but you don't know what somebody might have gone through. Has one of your players experienced child death, and then you just throw a child death experience on them. They might not like that. But you know your players best. But you might still want to, run things by them and say this is going to be a darker, heavier campaign than other campaigns. Maybe give them instances of some of the stuff they may encounter. Another interesting thing is this not very combat-heavy campaign. I'd say it's more roleplay focused, especially in some of the towns and villages. There's kind of like 3 settlements. But when you do get combat, it hits hard and can be really difficult. A famous example is there's a coffin shop where 6 vampire spawn are hiding, and some players might be encountering that at level 4. And vampire spawn are a challenge rating 5 enemy. Even taking down 1 at level 4 might be a bit of a challenge, but there's 6 of them. Some encounters may seem unwinnable. The idea might be that they need to run away, or maybe the vampire spawn, some people play at the vampire spawn, not all of them attack the players, some of them are trying to get out and cause chaos elsewhere, things like that. But the point I'm trying to make is there might be times where, or even a session or 2 where no combat happens, but the combat can be pretty brutal. All right, let's give an overview of the chapters in the book. Because if you learn one thing about Curse of Strahd, if you read up and research it, is that the book is kind of laid out in kind of a weird way. Because it's a sandbox campaign, I should have mentioned that earlier, it's a sandbox campaign. You know, it's pretty hard to say, you know, it's not linear. You can't really say, like with other campaigns, if they're more linear, chapter 1 is the beginning and one of the later chapters is near the end. So the chapters are kind of, a lot of them are different locations. So you've got your introduction with running the adventure and marks of horror. Chapter 1 is all about Strahd, the villain, the antagonist, his history, his goals, information and advice for role-playing him. And there's a section called Fortunes of Ravenloft, and this is possibly one of my favourite things about Curse of Strahd. You do what's called a Tarot reading. That's sort of the D&D in-universe version of a tarot reading. And it leads the players to different MacGuffins. There's 3 items. One is information about Strahd, it's essentially his journal. One is a holy symbol that can shed sunlight and trap vampires. And another is the Sun Sword, essentially a D&D lightsaber. The 4th and 5th card points the players to a ally. So I think there's about 20 NPCs dotted around the map who one of them will sort of become their ally and help them fight Strahd. And the last card is where will he be in his big, daunting, confusing layout-wise castle. And there's whole other videos about that. I've done a whole video where I talk about just the Tarot reading and give some example draws. And some people like to do it random, like the book says. Some people like to stack it so they can control where things end up. But hey, those are conversations for a whole other video. Chapter 2 talks about the land as a whole and talks about things like the mist border works. So talked about the mists earlier. The players can't leave, and that's another thing as well. It's a sandbox, but they can't go, oh, we're going to nip back to the Sword Coast for a bit. Nope, you're in Barovia until you've dealt with Strahd. You're in this for the long haul. Sunlight in Barovia isn't proper sunlight for the purposes of vampire hypersensitivity, so Strahd can walk around in the daytime, quote marks, and the only way to generate magic is things like the 2 MacGuffins I spoke of just now. It gives information about the local population, the Barovians, and information about the Vistani, who are the sort of travellers between domains in the mists who Strahd has given permission to. They're some of the few people who can kind of come and go as they please. There's random encounters for when they're walking from different points across the map. The rest of this chapter concerns minor locations, so things like roads, crossroads, but also one of the 2 Vistani camps where they get the Tarot reading, and the Mad Mage location right to the north of the map. It's kind of the more minor locations that don't deserve an entire chapter. And then most of the rest of the chapters from that point onwards are one chapter is a different location, and it kind of works from east to west, because most campaigns start at the east side of the map. I say most because that's what's kind of recommended. Some people start in other places, but I'd probably recommend just starting at the east. And they arrive at a village, which is chapter 3. So they should meet an NPC called Ismark, who says, help, my sister has been attracted the attention, should we say, of the Lord of the land. Can you please take her to another settlement for safety? And that kind of encourages the players to move to the sort of more central settlement of the 3. But it's not as simple as that, because, and this is what confuses people, chapter 4 is Castle Ravenloft, which is eastish to the map, but it's also considered the end game dungeon. There are times or opportunities they might appear before the end game, to when they're ready to fight Strahd. But it trips people up that they're like, okay, so am I supposed to run this chapter next? No, because it's a sandbox. Chapters aren't in story order. Then after that beast of a chapter, it's Vallaki, which is the central town. The old bone grinder, that's an old windmill run by 3 hags, Hag Coven. Argynvostholt. In Barovia's history, there was a silver dragon and an order of knights. But the dragon gets killed, as do all the order of knights, but they come back as revenge-seeking revenants. Very cool. Another village called Kresk, which has a sort of abbey at the top where the Frankenstein-style person I was talking about earlier does his stuff. Salanka Pass, which is just a route through the mountains that can have some stuff going on. It's quite a small location. Berez, a swamp where a very powerful witch lives who has ties to Strahd. Van Richten's Tower, which is again another small location where it could be a potential hideout for the players so long as they don't trigger its traps. The Wizard of Wine's Winery, which is, as it says, it's a winery and a vineyard, but when the players reach it, it's been taken over by some enemies. The Amber Temple, which is intended for, like, you know, just before the end game. It's a very high level dungeon, which has essentially got loads of vestiges that can offer dark gifts to the players, where they can get some really cool power, but there's some sort of drawback or flaw. Yes, the Hill, where the local druid population are doing a weird ritual. And the Werewolf Den, which is a werewolf den. Surprise, surprise. After that chapter, you get the epilogue chapter, what happens if you defeat Strahd or if Strahd wins. And in the appendices are character options, Death House, which is an optional starter dungeon, treasures, monsters and NPCs, the Taroka deck and more information about the different cards and their meanings, and handouts for the players, things like letters, Strahd's invitation if he invites them to the castle, the Tome of Strahd, which is the item that's his journal and the information in it, a journal excerpt of Rudolf van Richten, a famed monster hunter, and some other things as well. So, I can understand if someone looks at the book at first and finds it a little bit weird, but that's essentially like everything that's included. And the campaign generally plays out where they arrive from the east. As I mentioned a minute ago, they escort this NPC potentially to Vallaki, and that's when it opens up. So it becomes a bit of a sandbox. And there are sort of level suggestions that, you know, this location might be more suited for level 5 characters. This location might be better suited for level 9 characters. There is the risk then that players, like in RPG video games, might wander to a place that's got much tougher enemies than they are capable of dealing with. One of those things where you might be able to warn them through NPCs to saying, don't go to the swamp, it's really deadly, there's a powerful witch there, or things like that, or find other ways to deter them. And then you could probably drop hooks and seeds that kind of lead them to the easier places first, so they level up in line with the places that they, you know, should go to. A really cool thing about Curse of Strahd is not intended to be a villain who just waits at his castle, twiddling his thumbs, waits until the players get all the MacGuffins and are ready to fight him. He's supposed to be active. You're supposed to, if you can, introduce him multiple times throughout the campaign. If you introduce him fairly early, then they're obviously going to have no chance of defeating him, unless they get one of the 2 sunlight items I mentioned earlier. And then obviously it's the idea that, you know, he might scare the players and, you know, make them feel sort of threatened and watched as they kind of go through this journey. They might feel like they don't want to upset him because, you know, he might want to TPK them really early on. Another really cool thing about it is he's not just an ordinary vampire, and I try and hold off on this information for as long as possible. He's a wizard, so he can cast magic, so he's not just a vampire, he's a vampire who can cast magic. But he's also a general, so his backstory before he became a vampire was he was like a commander of an army on behalf of his father. So he's a very smart guy in terms of battle tactics. Did a whole other video talking about his battle tactics in the final battle. And ideally you should be playing him smart and tactically and ruthlessly, and not as someone who just stands in the middle of a room and is like, oh no, it's sunlight. Okay, let's get to the FAQs now. Is Curse of Strahd hard to run for DMs? It can be. I think you hear people say that other campaigns might be easier to run, especially those that are more linear. I think once you sort of get your head around it, and one of the biggest tips people say is make sure you read the book, because it's a sandbox and because the way the information's laid out is kind of all mixed around and some of it is buried away. There might be something about an NPC in chapter 11 that would be handy to know when you're reading the chapter 3 or chapter 4 location. It's worth reading the book cover to cover before you even start. But I think then as you kind of go through it and get to know it more, it does get easier, but it can be quite daunting and intimidating as campaigns go, especially compared to other campaigns. And what about for first-time DMs? Well, I did a video all about this fairly recently. The short version is, if you really want to do it, go for it. If you've got the time and the dedication and the passion to make it work, I'm sure it'll go great, but you might want to start with something smaller first, maybe a few one-shots or a sort of more beginner adventure like Norseman and Fandalva. And it's what I did, and I'm glad I did it. Is it hard for the players? I talked about this earlier. Yes, it can be. It can be, some of the encounters can be really hard, but I like the idea of when they start getting these MacGuffins, especially the ones that can cast sunlight, the tides start to turn and they get stronger and can face some of the threats a little easier. Should you surprise your players with Curse of Strahd? This was another video I did. Because in theory and on paper, it sounds like a good idea. Because they get sort of grabbed and spirited away from wherever they're from into this mysterious other world, you think, well, wouldn't it be cool to do that to the players? And they get sucked into the thing and they don't know they're going to run it, and it's like, aha, now I'm running Curse of Strahd. There are pros and cons, probably more cons than pros, unfortunately, and I talk about it in this video. What are the good things about Curse of Strahd? I think people like Strahd as a villain, and they like the story. The locations and the NPCs are really interesting. And I don't know, like I've said this in other videos, and this is probably a shocking confession, I'm not a massive fan of horror. I like dark fantasy, but I'm not a massive fan of horror. And I fell in love with it. So, like earlier I said, despite it not really being a sort of traditional D&D campaign, it's still really good and it's got a lot going for it. What are some of the criticisms of Curse of Strahd? Some people, despite people arguing that it's one of the better or maybe even the best 5th edition modular campaign, some people think it does have its flaws. As I said earlier, the book is, some stuff can be buried away and sometimes it can be really difficult to think, oh, I'm sure I read that somewhere. What was that? Was that in the random chapter information? Was it in Strahd information in chapter 2? Was it in a random NPC appendix information? It can be really difficult to sort of get your head around where everything is. And then most of the campaign and the locations are great. Some people argue that 1 or 2 are a little bit weaker. Things like the werewolf then, they're not as strong as other parts of the story. And it also might be hard to sort of usher the players or drop hooks for some of the places. The good thing about the Taroko reading I said earlier is that, if they end up with one of the items in the werewolf den, then great. They've got a reason to go to the werewolf den or try and find it. But they might not necessarily explore everywhere. And again, that's kind of fine. You might have players who are completionists who want to explore absolutely everywhere before they march on Castle Ravenloft. Or you might have people who miss some stuff, and that's okay as well. Are there mod guides? Yes, there's quite a few. I'll mention 3 really popular ones. There's Curse of Strahd Reloaded by Dragna Carter, who's kind of made it less horror and more heroic fantasy, I believe. There's Mandy Mod. She's done some great information where she sort of fleshes out different chapters and said, oh, you can consider doing these things and adding these things. And has added a few additional things as well, such as additional locations. And Lunch Break Heroes, who also do YouTube videos. They do videos covering sort of each location and giving ideas of, oh, you could add this and you can change this. And what are some tips for running Curse of Strahd? Well, I've got a video offering 15 tips, and they're just random tips. I scoured loads of posts on the Curse of Strahd Reddit and other places where people say, hey, anyone got tips for Curse of Strahd? I'm about to start Curse of Strahd soon. And basically cherry picked the most popular, most frequently given advice and put it in a video. So there you go. And that's it for this one. If you need more help running Curse of Strahd, like I said, I've got a whole channel dedicated to just Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. A whole playlist of all my Curse of Strahd videos covering things like resources, how travel works, how to avoid TPKs, alternative random encounters, and I've got some opinions as well, which originally I called them my controversial 3. It's now expanded to my controversial 4, where I say be careful if you want to make the map bigger, for example, increase the scale. And I'm not a big fan of rigging the Taroko reading, but I think there's another way that's kind of like a nice in-between. You can have it slightly rigged, but still slightly random, if that makes sense. And we'll leave it there for this one. Thank you, Mist Wanderers.